Live streaming, are we live there?
Yep.
Okay, great. Right. All right. Okay, I think we're ready to go. Okay, hello everyone. Happy International Women's Day on the 111th International Women's Day. It was an International Women's Day celebration in St. Petersburg that provided the spark, or shall we say the iskra, for the Russian Revolution, underlining how workers' movements, for all their limitations on this front, have been historically the strongest and most consistent supporters of the cause of women and feminism. International Women's Day was a public holiday in the Soviet Union and remains so today in Russia and Ukraine. Finally, women and feminists have been and remain in the vanguard for movements of peace. The 23rd February 1917 march of International Women's Day in St. Petersburg was critically a protest against war. Let's keep all this in mind as we begin the latest and I think one of the most critically important webinars that the International Manifesto Group has produced. It's entitled Fog of War over Ukraine. I'm Radhika Desai. I'm the convener of the International Manifesto Group. I speak to you today from Winnipeg, which stands on the stolen lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. It's worth recalling this given that questions of sovereignty are at the core of what we will discuss today. And there are few more serious and long-lasting violations of sovereignty in the world than that of indigenous peoples in the territories that are today called Canada and the United States. We are holding this event at a time, moreover, when standards of reporting could not sink lower. Entire Western media apparatuses have become propaganda machines peddling slimy, emotionally highly strung discourses of human suffering, which, while entirely valid, seem to completely evade the realities of the actual realities of conflict, the casualties, the hits, the actual troop movements, military gains and losses. We have to wade through a whole lot of emotional verbiage before we get well-placed lies. Let me just give you an example. Today, the Canadian public broadcaster, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation reported, and I say verbatim reported, that WHO has declared that Russia is attacking hospitals. When I looked for, written on the web for the story, the original stories, I found that the WHO had explicitly avoided mentioning the perpetrator. It did not say Russia was the perpetrator of these attacks. It merely reported that hospitals had been targeted, and that is, of course, a terrible thing. Of course, we hear nothing as well about the arming of civilians, including members of neo-Nazi and far-right organizations. There is about this only silence. Today, we want to discuss many questions that are essential to understanding how and why the conflict over Ukraine is likely to mark a turning point in our already rapidly changing world order. And we have with us to do this the experts from Russia, Ukraine, Britain, and the United States. Among the questions we want to help sort out are whether this is a war between Russia and Ukraine, between Russia and NATO, between the US and Russia, or is this a phase of the long-running war that the US has been fighting to stall its decline, a phase in which Ukraine has become a pawn for the United States? Did this war begin on the 24th of February last week, or last fall, or in 2014, when the West organized the Maidan counter-revolution in Ukraine, in 2008, when the West offered Ukraine and Georgia membership of NATO, in 2004 or 1999, when NATO engaged in 2 lots of expansion, or even going back to the way in which the West intervened to ensure the worst possible outcome of the end of communism, including the disastrous shock therapy. What are the United States goals here? Is the US merely seeking opportunities for its four rentier sectors, its military industrial complex, its mining complex in a white settler society, its fire insurance and real estate industries, and its other industries such as information and communication technologies, and a big pharma that critically rely on intellectual property rights and their forcible enforcement? Is it trying to set back rivals such as China and Russia? Is it merely trying to rein in allies and solidify NATO? Will the strategy of sanctions succeed? What has really prompted Russia's actions? Putin's domestic difficulties, which are not few, or the rubbishing of Minsk by the United States and Ukraine when they signed on November 10, 2021, the Charter on Strategic Partnership, that the anti-communist historian Robert Service called the key historic blunder by Washington that has led to this war? Why does NATO even exist when we have the United Nations and when the Warsaw Pact long ago ceased to exist? What are Russia's aims? Is it to demilitarize, denazify without occupation? Does it have some other aims? How will these aims be achieved? What are the roots and extent of neo-Nazis in Ukraine? A final couple of points. In this in this conflict that the US has ensnared Ukraine in, with the willing and even eager compliance of its president Zelensky, what can Ukrainians expect? The racism of reporters and opinion makers and even many ordinary citizens of Western countries favoring refugees from Ukraine, and the racism of some Ukrainians who keep underlining how European they are, how European their country is and their cities are. These things have recently made the headlines. Bad as they are, however, that is not the end of the story of racism in this conflict. Those rightly decrying the aforementioned racism do not appear to begin to suspect its ultimate reality, which is that racism is a consolation prize that poor whites receive from white elites, the prize that permits them to consolidate support among the former, whose economic subordination continues and may even get worse. What Ukrainians can hope to have from the embrace of the West, if they ever get there, from the conflict into which the West has landed them, will be an even lesser versions of the fortunes enjoyed, or should we say suffered, by other countries of the former East and post-Soviet space. In return for permitting the West the privilege of gutting their manufacturing to eliminate competition for Western corporations, of taking over the most lucrative parts of the economy, of exploiting their natural resources and cheap labor in situ, bereft of properly functioning economies, the people of these countries are offered the dubious privilege of traveling throughout the European continent so that ex situ they can earn low wages as farm workers and service sector workers, and yes, consider themselves white and European. And finally, how are we to understand the pattern of international support for various sides in this conflict? And in particular, what role is China playing and can China play at this dangerous conjuncture? As we proceed to discuss these and many, many other questions, let me underline one very important thing. This is a public meeting. There are many people here with a great variety of views, and there are many axes of opposition between them. In this context, we will keep the focus strictly on the facts and arguments. Please feel free to state yours, but please respect the right of all to make up their own minds. Please don't try to persuade others. You are not the keepers of their political consciences. If we can exit from this session a little more enlightened, that is all we seek here. Please keep your questions and interventions focused on finding out things, finding out facts and arguments that you need. That's great. That will benefit everybody. So we will warn anyone who we feel is not observing this very minimal protocol and observing minimal courtesy to others. And after that, we retain the right to eject people from this meeting and refuse re-entry to those who have not heeded our one warning. So with this now, we will go to our speakers. I will introduce the speakers one by one as they will speak. So the first speaker is, one second, please. Sorry, I've just lost my list of speakers. Give me a second. Okay, I'm sorry. I'm just going to introduce speakers very briefly. Our first speaker is Helena Morkushina. Helena Morkushina is an independent scholar and academic who has written extensively about Ukraine, about Russia, and their very, very complex interrelationship, both during the time of the Soviet Union and since. So Helena, please go ahead. Like all speakers, you have between 7 and 10 minutes. Please try to keep closer to 7 minutes so that we can have all the speakers, and then within a little over an hour, and then we will go to questions and answers. Go ahead, Helena.
I will try. Thank you, Radhika, for inviting me. You know, for me, it wasn't a difficult decision because I went silent since February 24th, because like many of Russia, how should I say, not sympathizers, but people who understand Russia, it was a shock when Russia declared war on Ukraine. Even on the day when this military operation started, or the day before, I was giving an interview to the Radio Canada in French, and I was explaining to them, you know, the premises I was hoping that the peaceful solutions could still be found, but alas, it didn't happen. So what I want maybe to talk about today is my understanding of the current situation as it unfolds, because you know, all of us follow these events and just the mind feels like exploding. But you know, the principal premises were there since, I would say, even since the fall of the Soviet Union, because I remember this. You know, I come from I lived in the Soviet Union, right? I'm a product of the Soviet Union. I'm a Soviet person. So I understand well, I mean, I hope that I understand what happened in my country since 1990. And the problem is that with this fall of the communist ideology, all of the post-Soviet space was left without any, you know, orientation, moral, political. And of course, the other ideology that was present, ready to grab, was this nationalism. Nationalism also can be of all sorts, you know, and I won't go into that, but if we look at Ukraine, and probably I will be speaking about Ukraine, Ukraine was in search of itself, and what they had this, and it's clear since the split of Verkhovna Rada in so-called national communists and then communists, and then how they flipped to the nationalist side. So Ukraine was on this trajectory away from Russia since the early 90s. And these are the realities of life. And they were hoping, and they still hope, that, you know, the West will accept them. And despite it just blows my mind when I see what Zelensky is saying and keeps saying. And unfortunately, they don't understand the very simple reality that Ukraine is bordering Russia and it's not going anywhere. And Ukrainians wanted, you know, they were like, the reality is that a lot of Western Ukrainians were working in Poland, where they became, you know, as Quebecois article was saying, that at some point Quebecers were white Negroes of North America. Ukrainians became white niggers of Western Union, unfortunately, Western Europe, including Poland. And up to one, so for Ukraine, this is a probably existential question, what road to choose. And unfortunately, Ukraine didn't have very politically savvy leaders that could hold this very difficult act of balancing between Russia and the West. And even now, when I see what addresses the Zelensky records, I'm blown up by what I hear, because he keeps affirming that Ukraine is a democratic state. He, who is a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, whose grandfather fought in the Great Patriotic War and won that war, he keeps claiming that Ukraine is a democratic country. Well, I'm sorry, but Ukraine is not a democratic country. And even though when I discuss with my Ukrainian friends, they say, no, Russian is not forbidden. Russian is spoke in Ukraine. What are you talking about? Well, I'm sorry, but you know, laws of a country are laws. And this new language law that was adopted in 2019, I believe it explicitly bans Russian from all spheres of public life. and all the national minorities, they have, we are talking about Russian-speaking Ukrainians and ethnic Russians, we are talking about millions. And other ethnicities in Ukraine, we count them in maybe in tens of thousands. Their languages are protected and they have rights. And Russian-speaking minority, there is no law that could protect them. So yes, the reality is different, but still, laws reflect any country's values and any country's rules of common life. And I don't see it in Ukraine. And Ukrainians, they didn't talk that much about people dying in Donbass and about Luhansk and Donetsk being bombarded by the Ukrainian army and about civilians being killed. Now Ukrainian suffering is all over the world, and the whole world stays united. There are enormous efforts in Canada as we speak, charity gathering people. It's such a beautiful story. It's a villain, Putin, who attacked democratic Ukraine. Well, like I said, first of all, my problem with Ukraine is that it is not democratic. I'm sorry. The other issue that I wanted to say, when I was listening to Ukrainians, maybe you didn't see it, but, I was hearing people posting this appeal on social media to knock off the road signs with names of villages, because Russians, they are so stupid, they wouldn't be able to drive in tanks, they would get lost themselves near and would turn in circles. To me, just is another sign how blind, how they don't know, those who travel to Western Europe, they don't go to Russia, and they have no idea how far Russia has come since the fall of the Soviet Union. And this is not a country, a backward country that will fall under the sanctions. And Putin is not a crazy lunatic who is afraid of, dying, being killed, and he launched this offensive on the whole world. So it's what I see, because all my Ukrainian friends, they are right. They are anti-Russian, especially when after this military intervention. And I don't know where it will end. There are many questions. The question that you raised, they are excellent questions, and I'm not very optimistic, because Ukrainians are good fighters and Russians are good fighters. Ukrainians they say they are defending their land, but they are much weaker militarily. And the reaction that I see from the West, they keep doing what they have been doing all these years, giving promises to Ukrainians, and now Ukrainians are learning under bombardments and under, in hiding in shelters, that the West will not help them. Because this is the reality, and what Zelensky does, it's an agony of I don't know, this, I call it, I don't know, it's naive. I don't even have terms how to qualify it, because he keeps signing these documents for the accelerated acceptance into the European Union. Before this panel, I was listening to his speech that he recorded towards the Europeans, and he was talking about Ukrainian Europe, and we are all Europeans. And it's the irony is that he started his speech by saying, this is, we say "Бажаємо здоров'я," now we say it to each other. But this is an irony, because "Здравия желаем" comes from the Soviet and Russian army, which is "I wish you health," right? Why out of a sudden, Ukrainians would start saluting themselves? What my point is that there is, I don't know why Ukrainians lack this wisdom to accept that duality of the Ukrainian nation, and it's a richness that Ukraine has. But somehow, I don't know, they looked upon the West hoping that they would help them, because many of them, I have friends who wanted to travel to Europe. It's a totally legitimate, desire and work in Europe and receive European salaries and live in Europe. But what they did not understand, that the road to this Europe, to this true democracy, lies through acceptance of others and others' point of view. Because what happened in Ukraine after Euromaidan, they essentially silenced people who didn't agree with this, and here is the root of the problem. So I will stop right here, and maybe we will have time to discuss all of this during the question period.
Thank you, Helena. That was really perfect timing and really important reflections. So from Helena and somebody who has roots in Ukraine, we go to Professor Oleg Barabanov. Oleg is a Russian historian and political scientist. He's program director at the Valda International Discussion Club and professor at Moscow's famous GIMO University, its International Relations and Diplomatic University. So Oleg, please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Radhika. Do you hear me now? It's okay.
Yes, we hear you very well.
Okay. Because the microphone was switched off. What I want to say that Putin's decision for the Russian society, both for the wider Russian society and to the political experts as well, to start the military campaign was absolutely unexpected because I discussed it with various Russian experts on international relations, on politics, very well informed experts, and just 2 weeks, 3 weeks before the start of the military campaign. And everybody was talking that everybody was not expecting the war, the start of the big war. And many people were thinking that it was a new round of a kind of a diplomatic blackmail that Putin used a year ago. Let's remember that a year ago in spring 2021, there was another escalation of Russian troops near the Ukrainian borders. Everybody expected the war. But then there was the telephone call from Joe Biden to Vladimir Putin. They organized their summit, and all became calmed. And now I think many experts were thinking that the idea was to repeat this kind of a diplomatic blackmail or diplomatic pressure to gain some more political profits to the Kremlin, to show that Putin not in isolation, that everybody is flying to Moscow, willing to speak to him, and so on. So that was the situation within Russia in February, that nobody, or in fact, or maybe very few people expected the start of the military campaign. It was interesting also to me when there was the first very long, about 1 hour, Putin's speech on 22 February with the recognition of Donetsk and Luhansk republics. There was a very tough speech with all with historical excursus and so on, totally anti-Ukrainian. And I thought personally that the speech was too tough on Ukraine, too blaming the Ukrainian government, just to be a simple preamble to recognize two small people's republics at the eastern Ukrainian border. So I thought it was a kind of imbalance between the content of the speech and the solution just to recognize the republics. But still, almost nobody expected the big war after the recognition as well. Because some people in the Russian expert and political community started to speak that this is the road to peace, paradoxically, that Russia now enters the territories of the People's Republics, So Ukraine stopped fighting at the front line with them, and there will be the peace and the conservation of the status quo, with very moderate sanctions on Russia done by the EU and the USA and the UK in these 2 days between the recognition and the start of the military operation. But in fact, the war started, and it was also interesting because the Russian propaganda, the Russian television, I mean the internal propaganda, the Russian television, they were also not doing nothing to, how to say, to prepare the people to the war before the start of the campaign. Because, you know, when you start the war, any war, you have to prepare your own population first. So I don't know if we open the textbooks on military campaigns, or textbooks on how the mobilizations was organized in history. So it's about 1 week before or a few days before you have to start the information, the propaganda campaign for your own population, just to raise, how to say, the patriotic spirit and the fighter spirit and so on. And it was done nothing. And during the first 2 or 3 days of the conflict, the Russian television was, for me, disorganized. They haven't yet received a clear commands from the Kremlin how to react to the war. The information was very scarce, very limited, and the Ukrainian counter propaganda was, counter information campaign was quite active. And that was the decision to start blocking the social media in Russia. They started to block, first to put some limitations and then to block totally the Facebook, starting from the day 3 or day 4 of the campaign. Now Facebook is totally blocked. The Twitter is also blocked. There are some talks that there are plans to block YouTube and Instagram, but for now, both platforms are working. And also because the population was not prepared propagandistically for the war. So it was a shock for everybody, for almost everybody. And if you can compare it, if I'm allowed to compare it with Crimean campaign in 2014, then for sure there was a huge support of the Crimean campaign within the wider Russian society. I don't mean political activists, I don't mean experts, but within the wider society, there was a real support of Putin's actions there. And there was a term quite widespread in Russia then, named the Crimean consensus. And it was a real support of Putin's actions in Crimea. And now, taken in comparison the Crimean situation then and the military campaign now, many experts were saying that the so-called Donetsk consensus is lacking in the Russian society because there is no signs of euphoria in the faces of the ordinary people and so on. Then the campaign of so-called collective letters for peace started within Russia. then some academicians, some musicians, some actors, and other well-known personalities within Russia started to organize either individual or collective letters for peace. Ironically, also the daughter of Putin's press secretary, Dmitry Peskov, who is the key rooter of Putin's propaganda, yeah, I see, right, also supported pro-peace, and she put some pro-peace posts in her Instagram. And there was some protest campaign within Russia the first evening after the 24th February, where about more than 1,000 people were briefly arrested. And the second campaign is just today. In Siberia and Urals, I've seen that there are about 2,000 people arrested. Let me excuse for Boris, because Boris, as far as I know, is in Siberia now, supporting to organize some protest campaigns. So it's not, is that the reason? Because he is missing our meeting. So, and just for conclusion, we have sure that I understand this global appeal for peace, and I can understand these anti-Russian feelings now rising globally. And maybe what we could also discuss within our group as the International Manifesto group, the left-wing group. So there are two logics. One logic that I understand that almost everybody of us is against the mainstream global imperialism, being it the US White House imperialism, the UK imperialism, and so on. And in that sense, it's I can see a kind of dilemma for the foreign anti-imperialists, because Putin is proclaiming that he is fighting the US imperialism in Ukraine. That is to some extent true. And does it mean that anti-imperialists must support Putin, that he is, just because of the fact that he is fighting the common enemy, the US imperialism? This is one logic. And another logic that we can see the clash of two imperialism, the mainstream global imperialism led by the United States, and the new revisionist imperialism led by Russia. So in that clash of two imperialism, there could be the position of imperialists to condemn both. So it's up to everybody to choose. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Oleg. We now go to our, and by the way, I have to say thank you particularly for stepping in at the last minute, and thank you for your really, I think, important comments, because what you are expressing is a very important current of opinion, and we need to take that into account. So thank you. And you, I think, raised very important dilemmas as well. Our next speaker is Rania Khalek. Rania is a Lebanese-American writer and political activist. She has written for politically progressive and left-wing publications, including The Nation, The Intercept, Al Jazeera, Salon, Vice, Alternate, Mondoweiss, and Truth Out. In 2017, she co-hosted the podcast show Unauthorized Disclosure, and she today runs a Breakthrough News, which is a very important podcast show, a video show. And as you will know, she has been paying a lot of attention to current events in Ukraine, and some of you will have seen her excellent interview with Boris Kagarlitsky. So, Rania, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And it's really an honor to be a part of this panel with all of these excellent speakers. I want to talk about a few aspects of what's taking place. And I think one of the most surprising things to come of this war so far is how there's almost no attempt to end it. And, I've covered war zones for most of my career as a journalist, and I've just never seen a situation where there's almost zero attempt in the world to try to come to some sort of ceasefire. Everyone is escalating. And the US and NATO, we know, prepared the stage for this. Senior US officials and others have over the last 2 decades or more warned this would be the outcome of NATO expansion. And now that those warnings have come to fruition, the media especially is totally erasing the NATO and US role in pushing Russia into a corner. And that's not to justify anything or to say this was a great decision by the Russians, but they were painted into a corner. And how we got here, it's almost like the timeline starts as soon as the invasion starts, and we never hear what happened before that. And, the capitalist media in the West has gone into overdrive manufacturing consent for dangerous escalation, not even 2 weeks into the invasion. And we're not even 2 weeks into the invasion. And according to a Reuters Ipsos poll, something like 3/4 of Americans would support a no-fly zone in Ukraine. I mean, obviously not knowing that the consequences of that could be nuclear Armageddon, which is another aspect of this that's being completely erased by the media. How dangerous this potential confrontation between nuclear armed powers, should this continue, how dangerous that is for the world. Meanwhile, the West is banning RT and other Russian media in a shocking display of censorship. I mean, the fact that they were able to implement the ban so quickly on the internet shows that the infrastructure to shut down opposing views was already in place and, will at some point probably be used against people like us who oppose war. So it makes you wonder if this is, I guess, one of the Western values that the US and these NATO powers claim to be fighting for by arming the Ukrainians. So now we're only getting, one side of the story, which glorifies the Ukrainian narrative as pure and true, while shutting down Russian perspectives, shutting down dissenting viewpoints. And, we know that in war, everyone lies. Everyone lies to benefit their own side. That's natural. That's normal. So it's crucial that we hear from everyone. So we can see what everyone's saying. We can see what the Russians are saying, what the Ukrainians are saying what the independent outlets are saying. And then we can get a general picture of what's taking place from there. But instead, we're getting this black and white framing of good Ukraine versus this evil Russia. And this drive to war with Russia has created this frightening climate of racism against Russians, of censorship, of militarism, a lot of which reminds me and many others of the post 9/11 era, where anybody who questioned it or opposed escalation or called for, or in this case is calling for the dissolution of NATO, we're all being branded as like these treasonous Putin apologists who need to be shunned and censored. And at the same time, we have the Biden administration openly funding an insurgency. The Washington Post has just reported plans for preparing the groundwork for Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine to lead a government in exile based in Poland, from where the Ukrainian insurgency will be organized, armed, and trained once they're predicting that the Russians win and taking out the government in Ukraine. We saw Hillary Clinton on MSNBC days ago laying out how the Mujahideen in Afghanistan is the model, she called it the model for Ukraine, which is disgusting to say, given what happened in Afghanistan and is still happening in Afghanistan. This obviously isn't about helping Ukrainians. It's about bleeding the Russians, fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainians. And at this point, funding and arming an insurgency, and we need to be clear about this, guarantees that bloodshed in Ukraine will continue for years. And just like with the unintended consequences from the Mujahideen insurgency, which is what Hillary Clinton called it, meaning the seeding of the precursor to Al-Qaeda, which later carried out 9/11, there's a similar danger of unintended consequences in Ukraine, one the media is already downplaying or outright ignoring. And this is perhaps the second most alarming aspect of this war. The empowerment of the global far right, which we've heard for years is increasingly dangerous. We have thousands of foreign fighters flocking to Ukraine right now with the encouragement of Western governments and the facilitation of the Ukrainian leadership under Zelensky. And we know that the US has already been arming neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine since 2014. They're the most ideologically motivated, so it actually makes sense for them to be flocking to Ukraine, because who else is going to fight an insurgency except for the most ideological people? And we know that far-right ideologues from the US and Europe have already spent time training with people in Ukraine. So you can only imagine how many of these so-called foreign fighters traveling there are motivated by this white nationalist ideology. And while Russia may have exaggerated the power of these people in the Ukrainian government, the US and its media stenographers are completely downplaying and whitewashing this, as we saw with a recent PBS interview that glorified a mayor of a Ukrainian town, as he had a picture of a neo-Nazi behind him and is known to be a part of a neo-Nazi group. And you know, the hypocrisy of all of this is just astounding. The same leaders who invaded Iraq and killed 1 million people in that country, if not more, the same leaders who are currently, right now, as we're speaking, are starving both Yemenis and Afghans, the same leaders who label Palestinian terrorists for throwing rocks at Israeli tanks, you know, the same leaders who took every opportunity to escalate rather than de-escalate the conflict in Ukraine since 2014, have suddenly decided that they believe in international law with regard to Russia, and they're celebrating and promising to arm this amazing Ukrainian resistance. And we can't let them forget, by the way, that they're starving Yemen and they're occupying Syria and militarizing Africa and starving people in Latin America, because, you know, people will say this is whataboutism, but reminding people of this isn't whataboutism. It's essential to understanding imperialism and how their support for more war in Ukraine is a part of imperialism. And anyways, I'll leave it there. You know, I also wanted to talk about sanctions. We can talk about that when I'm sure people want to bring it up in the Q&A session. I do just want to say that I think it's so important that we have panels like this right now, because we're really this is one of the only places where we can offer people analysis and an alternative to what they're being bombarded with in the mainstream media right now.
Thank you so much. I just want to echo somebody in the chat saying standing ovation for Rania. Thank you very much, Rania, for raising two, I think, very, very important issues. Of course, sanctions are important, but in addition, I think you've raised the very important possibility, now increasingly turning into a probability, that the West is going to keep the Ukraine conflict festering. They are doing everything in their power. You mentioned certain things, and I noticed this morning statements from Johnson, Truss, and Raab, all essentially putting out plans which mean that they're going to keep this thing cooking for a very long time. And of course, the threat of fascism, which is increasingly the West is increasingly encouraging on the model of its encouragement of the Mujahideen, and we all know where this is going. But I think even more than the Mujahideen, the fascists will be a lot more dangerous. Okay, without taking up any more time, I will turn to the next speaker, Brian Becker. Brian also needs very little introduction in the sense, and you will have seen one of his videos on the present situation, which has really got an enormous number of views. I think it was with Amy Goodman, but I just remember Brian in it. Anyway, Brian is the national coordinator of the Answer Coalition and founder and central organizer of a founder and a central organizer of the Party of Liberation and Socialism. So Brian, please go ahead.
Thank you, Rania, and thank you to everyone. Because time is short, I'm gonna go briefly instead of extensively, and I appreciate all the other comments from the other speakers. Part of the issue here, of course, is where you are in the world. We are in the United States, and in the United States, we have a special obligation to be able to demonstrate persuasively with facts, with in persuasive arguments, that it is in fact the United States and NATO that created this crisis, that when Russia announced that they had red lines at the end of December and amassed troops along Ukraine's border on the east and on the north, in other words, when there was a plan A, a negotiated settlement, and a plan B, the threat of military action, it would have been very easy for the United States to say yes, instead of saying no to Russia's legitimate demands that Ukraine, with a 1,200-mile border with Russia, not be the staging ground for advanced missiles, conventional and nuclear missiles, whose flight time to Russian targets would be 5 or 6 minutes. And that this comes just 2.5 years after the US canceled the Gorbachev-Reagan INF treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Range Treaty, that banned those kind of weapons. having lifted the ban and having Ukraine become a de facto member of NATO, not necessarily a formal member, and the placement of advanced weapons that would begin now or has already begun, but would continue and continue, the US could easily recognize that Russia's demands were legitimate. Make Ukraine neutral, say yes to that, and guarantee that advanced weapons like these would not be placed in Ukraine. But instead, the US not only said no, and not only said no, 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 it also, at the same time, as we know now from declassified or classified documents that have been leaked and reported on by the Washington Post, that the US exponentially increased arms shipments of advanced weapons into Ukraine starting in early December 2021. So they said no to the negotiations. And not only did they say no, they escalated the fear that Russia would have because they were indeed placing these weapons. Now, in America, we have to point out to the people of the United States that the government that invades Ukraine, invaded Vietnam, invaded Korea, all the other invasions, the endless invasions, the wars that took millions of lives, is now crying crocodile tears for Ukrainians when there's been no one's been held to account for all of these endless war crimes by American imperialism. Russian opera singers are being told, you must denounce your government or else, and they are being replaced. No American opera singer was told, denounce George W. Bush for the invasion of Iraq, or Obama for the bombing of Libya, or else you're out of your job. This kind of hysteria in America requires us as anti-imperialists to focus on the role of the United States and imperialists. For the comrades in Russia, for the comrades in Ukraine, there are different tasks, undoubtedly. And it's not that these are completely separate tasks, they are overlapping tasks. I mean, we as American socialists care about what socialists and Marxists in Russia are thinking. We care about what anti-imperialists are thinking. We recognize that the dissolution of the Soviet Union by Boris Yeltsin and the leader of the then Republic of Ukraine illegally in December 1991, the illegal dissolution of the Soviet Union was a great historic tragedy for Ukrainians, for Russians, and for anti-imperialists and working class socialists globally. And here we are after 30 years of bourgeois rule in both countries, Ukrainians and Russians who fought together to defeat fascism, who fought together and worked together and shared the cooperation and benefits of socialism, are now killing each other. So if you're a Russian or if you're a Ukrainian and you are a Marxist and a socialist and see that the current government in Russia has no forward-looking vision for the world, no a better world is possible vision of the world, that yes, it has legitimate concerns about Russia's national security, and it doesn't want to be treated as a diminished neo-colonial state in spite of the power and size of Russia. Those are understandable from the point of view of the Russian government, even a bourgeois government. Those are legitimate issues, very legitimate and national interests. But we are socialists, we are Marxists, and we are promoting the unity of the people against imperialism, and not happy to see the resort of military operations that are not explained, that cannot really contribute and build solidarity between the peoples, between the two republics, and of course, offers no vision for a different world. So we're in different places, we have different tasks, they do overlap. I do want to say that it was perplexing for us as well that the Russian government and the Russian media consistently denied right up until the very moment of the military operation that Russia had any intention of moving in. Even the Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman laughed about it. She said, oh, please tell us when the Russian invasion of Ukraine will be so I can schedule my vacation plans. I mean, this had the impact of politically unpreparing the population, not only in Russia, but anti-imperialists in Europe, anti-NATO activists in Europe and globally for what was coming. There was no political preparation, as if politics doesn't matter, as if consciousness doesn't matter, when of course, we believe as socialists that the consciousness, the intentionality of the masses of people is the most decisive element in world politics and can't be diminished. So we don't know yet why there was a sudden decision or a seemingly sudden decision to change tack and to actually militarily intervene in Ukraine. We don't know. I think more will be learned as we go forward about that. Certainly, I think what Putin did, what the Russian government did, was violate a basic tenet of what had been Soviet foreign policy, which was don't let the imperialists unite against us. Don't let all of the imperialists unite against us. When you think of the 1930s and the government in the Soviet Union sought a collective security agreement with Britain and France and perhaps the United States against fascism, and when it was rejected, decided to have a non-aggression pact with Germany, there was a decision made, we won't let the imperialists unite against us. And when the Germans invaded, the Soviets formed an alliance with the British and the Americans. Putin's actions being conducted the way they have has successfully united the imperialists against Russia. So from a tactical point of view, it seems to be a very dramatic shift in Russian thinking, in Russian foreign policy thinking, strengthening the hand of imperialism. But obviously the Russians have calculated, this is what I believe anyway, that war was coming, that if you read Putin's speeches, especially the way he talked about the non-aggression pact with Germany, or sort of referred to it, that it was appeasement and that it made the country unprepared for the coming invasion of Germany and millions died unnecessarily. One must come to the conclusion, if he is sincere, that Putin or some section of his establishment concluded war is actually coming one way or the other. And instead of passively waiting, we're going to take the first step. We're going to take territory, not just the eastern part of Ukraine, but all of it in order to secure Russia's perspective going forward. If that's the case, we don't know whether it's a wise or unwise political move. It does have the at least momentary impact of weakening anti-imperialism and weakening the anti-NATO position of people in Europe. And if you think European public opinion doesn't matter, that too would be a significant shift in Russian or earlier Soviet foreign policy. Again, I'll conclude with this. Please look at the WikiLeaks document from 2008 that shows that American officials realized when they said at the Bucharest summit that NATO would include Georgia and Ukraine, that it was likely to incite a civil war in Ukraine. And yet in 2014, with the coup d'etat against the Yanukovych government, ending the de facto neutrality of Ukraine, clearly the American government decided, knowing what it knew, that it promoted civil war in Ukraine, and to what end? Only to provide a pretext or a justification for the full entrance of NATO into Ukraine. Thus, again, and I'll conclude on this, we blame US imperialism in NATO for deliberately, recklessly creating a crisis that could easily escalate, especially as public opinion is shifting here, demanding a no-fly zone, that if opportunist politicians gave into that sentiment, which they helped create, along with the mass media, we could be on the verge of a global conflict. This is how big wars start, and anti-imperialists have to address a number of issues, as do socialists, about the need for international solidarity against imperialism, locating imperialism as the primary enemy. And by imperialism, I mean US imperialism and its military alliance in NATO. But we have to also have tactics that show that we have a vision of the future, that we're not camp followers of this or that government in a multipolar or emerging multipolar world, but we have our own independent, working class, internationalist, and socialist perspective, the one that can really win the workers of the world over to a perspective of real peace. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Brian. That was really excellent. You raised so many thought-provoking points about what different leftists have to do at various places, and the propaganda victories of the West that have been absolutely real, but they are propaganda victories. Okay, before we go into the second half of our presentations, let me just say that at the end of the presentations, we will have questions and answers. You may want to put your questions and answers in the Q&A section rather than in the chat section, or if you raise your hand after the speakers have finished, I will promote you to panelists so that you can put your question in person. You can choose either way. Okay, our next speaker is John Ross. John is Senior Fellow at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies, Renmin University of China. And since 1992 and the publication of his Why Economic Reform Succeeded in China and Will Fail in Russia and Eastern Europe, he has written over 500 pieces, probably more now, I'm reading a slightly dated biography here, on China's economy and geopolitical relations, but he has also been a close observer of events in the in Russia, where he has visited repeatedly both before and after the fall of the Soviet Union. So, John, please go ahead.
Yeah, obviously, I think I should start off by explaining my intersection with this situation. In 1991, when the Soviet Union collapsed, it was obvious that there was going to be a fundamental change in the world situation. So I moved to Moscow. And from 1992 to 2000, I lived in Moscow. I don't want to attempt to claim great credit or anything, but I had my material was published and distributed to all members of the Russian parliament and so on. So that's just to say that it was not an accidental interaction, therefore, with the situation in Russia. I must say that I do not agree with Helena, or I don't agree with Oleg on the tactical things. I was not surprised by the outbreak of the war. And I can show this very clearly. On various WhatsApp groups that I'm a member of, there were various members of the Western left who were saying that what has been the attacks on Russia for the threat of war, or the equivalent of weapons of mass destruction, lies made by the US before the Iraq war. And I intervened, I sent them messages saying, this is not correct. There is a real threat of war. More important than that, 30 years before, I said to various people in Russia who I had to advise, because I was asked my advice, that there's going to be a civil war in Ukraine. I thought actually that it would take place before it has done now. So therefore you can say the timing was wrong, but that was the fundamental situation. Why? Because it's interaction of the situation within Ukraine and with the international situation. Ukraine is a state, but it is not a single nationality. There are, in fact, a number of nationalities in Ukraine, actually very small minorities, Romanians, Hungarians, etc. But fundamentally, there are two nations within Ukraine. One is Western Ukraine, which speaks Ukrainian. It follows the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and was for a long period part of Poland. And there is the Eastern Ukraine, which for about 200 to 300 years, depending on exactly where, has been part of Russia. This is the national question within the Ukraine. Now, it's true that the unity of the Ukrainian state could be maintained as long as there was no attempt by one part of the country to impose its will upon the other part of the country. Let me take a comparison, which some people will be very familiar with, which is Canada. Canada has just about maintained its unity by a bilingual policy. It shouldn't be forgotten that about twice, Quebec has come very close to demanding independence. If you had an attempt to suppress the Russian language, to suppress the people in the east of Ukraine, this is entirely comparable to if, for example, it was suddenly announced in Canada that French was not to be spoken outside Quebec, that the language laws which maintain bilingualism in Canada were to be scrapped. What would happen is undoubtedly it would push the majority of the population of Quebec over the barrier from wanting to be part of a binational state to wanting to be an independent state. That is the situation. The reason for estimating, therefore, that there would be a civil war in the Ukraine was because the United States had no intention of allowing a neutral situation. The neutrality of Ukraine could have been maintained, or the unity of Ukraine could have been maintained by a neutral policy. for Ukraine. But the United States never had any intention of respecting this. And it was obvious that if the United States moved into Ukraine to attempt to impose international policies, membership of NATO, which was unacceptable to Russia and unacceptable to the Russian minority within the east of Ukraine, if it carried out actions such as banning the official use of the Russian language, which is spoken by 30% of the population of the Ukraine, if it did that, it would split up Ukraine, resulting in the civil war. And I had no illusions that it would be the aggressive intention of the United States to pursue such a policy. That's why I believed civil war was was the outcome that was likely in Ukraine. Second situation, what is this? This is a continuous policy of aggression by the United States against Russia. Everybody knows, and we could give lots of quotations, that the United States promised that NATO would not advance into Eastern Europe after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. That was systematically violated. But it's also the case that Russia attempted to make very great goodwill gestures towards the United States, to the point where Putin admitted that Russia proposed even to enter into NATO, which would have given Russia veto rights over the aggressive actions against Russia. It attempted to come to an agreement with the United States in the fight against Islamic terrorism after the US invasion of Afghanistan. I actually think that Russia had illusions in the United States at the time and made excessive concessions, but leave that aside. What was absolutely clear was Russia was not pursuing an aggressive policy against the United States, but the United States pursued an aggressive policy against Russia. What then happens? This determines the internal dynamics within Russia. Russia is being subject to aggression, and therefore the forces within Russia are those forces which will defend the country. The most decisive issue in Russia is Russian patriotism. I very much regret that Boris is not here and that Alexander Buskalin is not there. They were my earliest contacts in Russia. And I'm afraid, my view, that they failed to understand that the situation in Russia is a fight for Russia's defense against the Western aggression. And for that reason, the KPRF has become the dominant force of the left in Russia, because it understands that what is engaged in Russia is a fight for Russia's right to power and defense against the aggression by the United States. Finally, just to put it in an international context, the way I would put it is that the struggle in Ukraine is the Western flank of the defense of China. Because what is happening is, it is not the case that the United States foreign policy establishment regards Russia as its most important enemy. It doesn't. The United States foreign policy establishment, whatever their differences on tactics, regards China as its most important enemy. But it understands that the good relations between China and Russia are a big obstacle to United States aggression against China. And therefore, its aim is to separate China and Russia and create bad relations. Some of them want to do it by, excuse me, sexist phrase, but by seduction, that is, making concessions to Russia. Others want to do it by forcing Russia to break with China, but they all agree that they want to separate China and Russia because it will then be much easier to attack China. So China has a direct interest in this. So we may put it in the following way. The most fundamental enemy of the United States foreign policy is China. In order to attack China, it has to separate Russia from China. Incidentally, as a third thing, not the most important, it also wants to do in Germany, because by weakening the economic relations between Russia and Germany, it weakens Germany. Therefore, the aggressive policy of the United States towards Russia is aimed at 1, China, 2, Russia, and 3, Germany. Right, then don't worry, 10 seconds, Radical, right, okay. Therefore, Russia has, for the 4th time in the last 2 centuries, engaged in a struggle to defend itself. The first was the invasion by Napoleon. The second was the invasion by the whites in 1918. The third was the invasion by Hitler in 1941. And this is now the 4th situation in which Russia has to defend itself against aggression coming from Europe. And that's the fundamental features of the situation, and all else is tactics, propaganda, etc. End.
Okay, great. Thank you, John. That you can see all your appreciation in the chat. Meanwhile, very important points. So thank you for that, and looking forward to the question and answer. Now, going directly to our next speaker, Sarah Flounders is a longstanding political activist and author. She's based in New York City and is a leader of the United National Anti-War Coalition and the International Action Center. She's author of numerous books, including 2 in particular that directly relate to our topic today. The first is NATO expansion, NATO in the Balkans, and the second is Hidden Agenda, US NATO takeover of Yugoslavia. And considering that the dismemberment of Yugoslavia is very much in the minds of people as the West increases the pressure on on Russia, tightens the screws on Russia, I think Sarah's remarks would be very much appreciated. Sarah, please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Radhika, and thank you for this panel, because we need to be clear on what's happening. I want to start by saying this war could end today, if the US would stop pumping billions of dollars of lethal weapons and US advisors into the Ukraine, and would stop actively shelling the 1,200-mile Russian border. This is what's going on. And in the meantime, we are being carpet bombed by the media. So unless we make concrete demands to disband NATO, to denounce NATO as the war machine, and have a coherent explanation of what's happening, we will not have an opposition to this war here in the center of imperialism. We need concrete demands and a real explanation. NATO is encircling Russia with military bases, yes, but also is waging a war in Ukraine right now. They are the instigator and the provocateur. For 8 years, US officials and their military machine have fueled and organized to use Ukraine as a pawn for the war on Russia, have shelled the Russian border for 8 years. This is without a doubt. There's just no mention in the media that it's US NATO weapons that are responsible for 14,000 civilian deaths in East Ukraine and the Donbass region. This is a war on the People's Republic of Donbass and Lugansk. There's no mention of the 20 years of expanding NATO military bases that encircle Russia in Poland, Hungary, Romania, the former Soviet republics on the Baltic Sea. It is the United States that refuses to negotiate. Now, there are endless calls for Russian troops out of Ukraine. How about we raise in a unified way US troops, advisors, US weapons out of Ukraine? We got to acknowledge that they are there now. And that's Biden says it publicly, even in the State of the Union, how many billions of dollars more in weapons will be pumped in. It's not that this is an unknown, hidden fact. So I want to urge that we really think more seriously, especially in the US, Britain, and the EU, and Canada, about our slogans. When you hear Russian troops out, followed smaller, undercase, lower, stop NATO expansion, really, then we're becoming an echo chamber for the war machine and for the unanimous voice of US politicians, Democrat and Republican alike, all the corporate media. Now, Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it has become a de facto NATO member for sure. So saying that Russia did not start this war, the US did, is a way of really reversing and understanding what happened. Why is NATO encircling Russia? And is Ukraine so weak? They're backed by the entire NATO military machine. So I think we need to really think how we're explaining this and the slogans we use, where we're going with it. Why is NATO expanding? It's not only doubling in membership. It's not just a geographic surrounding for the future. It's not just will Ukraine be a member of NATO? It's this whole array of lethal weapons, of staged war maneuvers on Russia's border and in the Black Sea and in the Baltic Sea. That's what's going on. These are the facts on the ground that threaten Russia. More and more weapons being put in place, thousands of US advisors, along with volunteers, fascist volunteers, military contractors, are being pumped into the Ukraine. And they've been there for these 8 years. At the same time, while these weapons are pumped in, who's refusing a no first strike on nuclear weapons? It's the US who refuses to do that. So we're in the first days of a world-threatening crisis. NATO lit the fuse. Let's look at how we can challenge even the propaganda so we don't uncritically accept it. It's said again and again, this is the biggest war since World War II. That's false. Biggest war in Europe since World War II. False. It was 78 days of NATO bombing of Yugoslavia in 1999. 78 days, 28,000 bombs hit 480 schools and 14 tanks, 33 hospitals. I was in Yugoslavia during the war, not as a correspondent, in a solidarity delegation. We visited the hospitals, the schools, saw the injuries, massively, intentionally destructive. That was the first step in expanding NATO. Happened throughout the war. And it ended with the US building the biggest base, Camp Bondsteel. How could we forget that? To establish their power. Now, what else does the corporate media want us to forget and that we got to respond and answer to again and again? There's a war in Syria going on right now. I was in Syria several times during the US bombing, the arming of thousands of mercenary fighters. There were US bombers, US troops, US bases. It's not hidden. It's by proclamation. Democrat and Republican, they have supported this war. Syria demands they leave. Why not address this US invasion of Syria? There's a US-backed war in Yemen going on right now and a US naval blockade of Yemeni ports. There are US troops in AFRICOM just tearing up Africa. They just bombed Somalia, I think Friday. So and then we can't forget 20 years of ruin in Afghanistan and the US NATO troops finally being thrown out. Totally erased from any mention in the media is the 7 months of the bombing of Libya and the long years of war and then occupation of Iraq, more than 1 million dead. Now, the war in Ukraine is a danger of total war, and it is pulling in the world.
One minute, please, Sarah.
Okay, what we need to understand is US imperialism needs war. They continually, massively use war. It's to target Russia, it's to target China. They've planned this war on Russia. It's not a miscalculation. Russia warned again and again that they would defend. They moved the troops daily, they made daily announcements, and now it's on our doorstep. If I could just say a word about the sanctions, because the sanctions are really a further push. course, there's 41 countries that can't go along with the sanctions because they're already sanctioned. But it is significant. And the sanctions really are a war crime in every sense, deliberately targeting the civilians. But it is important for us to recognize that India and Pakistan and Indonesia, Brazil, Argentina, even Mexico on the US border, Nigeria, South Africa, Turkey, a NATO member, are refusing to go along with the sanctions, even though there's great pressure to comply. So these are the crises and the confrontations that are being set up. And in the meantime, they continue sending the troops, more troops, more troops. We were at an anti-war demonstration yesterday, a few hundred people. We were surrounded, I want to say surrounded by thousands of Ukrainians with signs calling for a no-fly zone. We refused to run, to fold up our rally. We managed to hold a 2-hour rally. That was not easy to do, but it's an exact example of the media situation, the global situation. We are surrounded and saturated with propaganda. And yet if we stand up, if we hold firm, if we refuse to run and continue to focus on no war, no NATO war, I think we will remain strong and coherent together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Important reminders about NATO expansion and I think very, very chilling account of your recent demonstrations. I'm sure many of us are going to such demonstrations and are experiencing similar things. So thank you very much. Our next speaker is Victor Figueroa Clark. Victor is a Chilean British researcher and author. He's based in London and teaches at the LSE. He's contributing editor of the website Alborada. His first book was about Salvador Allende, Revolutionary Democrat, which was published in 2013. And in addition to his research on Latin America, we should know that Victor went to school for many years in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s and speaks fluent Russian. And he has been following events in the Ukraine very closely. So Victor, we are all agog to hear from you.
Thank you, Radhika. I should note that I no longer teach at the LSE. But I did do for a time Cold War history, Russian history, Latin American history, and that I guess is the main perspective from which I'm approaching this situation. I think the level of hysteria in the West and the complexity of the issues that we've been discussing here today reflect the historic nature of this conflict and the importance it has for the future of the world. And I think there are many Russian specialists at the moment who are describing this as an epochal moment, the end of the Yalta system of international relations and the beginning of the establishment of a new system in international relations. I think, broadly speaking, there are 4 general keys which help us to understand the situation today, and we've been discussing them, or the speakers that have spoken so far have been discussing them. The first is the nature and the character of the international system. The second is the character of the Ukrainian state and the history of Ukrainian nationalism. The third is the nature of the Russian state and its security interests. And I think the last category is really the history of the relationship between the United States and NATO and Russia over the last 20 years, fundamentally. And I think a lot has been said so far. I would just note that unlike one of the previous speakers, I think that we can only really speak at global level of one imperialism, and it's the imperialism of a global financial system. And there may be efforts to resist this system, but they don't necessarily reflect what I would consider to be a global imperialism. And I think that the international system is characterized by an imperialist situation. But within this, I think we need to bear in mind that there is an imperial core, which we could see as being centered around the United States and the Anglo-speaking countries, Canada, Britain, and so on. an outer core consisting of the Western European states and some states in the Asia Pacific region, and a periphery, an exploited periphery, which are subject to this system, but are not really beneficiaries of it in any meaningful sense. And within this system, we know that the United States plays the role of the main beneficiary. It's also the main guarantor and the main executor that defends this system. And I think that it's important to note that this system is under challenge, and it has been since 2008. Internally, there's been an ideological crisis, the collapse of neoliberalism, for example. There's an economic crisis which I think has been more evident since COVID-19 struck. And I think that this crisis is reflected in the system's increased use of violence and coercion in order to police the periphery and, let's face it, loot it. You know, the billions that have been stolen from the people of Libya, the people of Venezuela, are testament to the parasitic nature of this imperial system. But the fact that it's under challenge is really important for looking at the situation in Ukraine, because it explains, I think, why the United States is so hostile to Russia, because Russia is one of two, what we might call contender states, which are challenging this US hegemony and this imperial system that the United States built after the Second World War. And I think if we, to speed through this, if we look at what purpose the Ukraine crisis serves, it is fundamentally to weaken China, as John was saying before, in order to later or simultaneously also weaken China. It is to tear Russia and the European Union apart so as to be able to control the European Union more effectively, fundamentally through Germany. Nevertheless, I think the fact that Russia was forced to invade the Ukraine is a severe political defeat for Russia, at least in the short term. Much will depend on what happens in Ukraine in coming years. But at the moment, Russia is suffering from a lot, from a defeat, at least in the second area that I thought I could contribute to is assessing the nature of the Ukrainian state. In my research on Latin America, I spent a lot of time trying to work out what perhaps what fascism looked like in the 21st century. And I think that Ukraine, in one way or another, forms a case study for the most developed form of 21st century fascism that we see in the world today. And when I talk to some leftists in the UK about this, they often sort of say that, well, Ukraine is a democracy, really. Yeah, there are fascists there, but show me a country that doesn't have any fascists in it. Others seem to think that fascism is a historic phenomenon. It's from the 1930s, it's jackboots and so on. But I think if we look at the theory, we know that fascism is evident in its class content and in the means it uses in order to achieve its class goals. And when we look at Ukraine from that perspective, I think we can see the fascistic nature, or at least the hegemony of fascistic discourse in Ukraine and in the domination of the Ukrainian state, which made a diplomatic solution to this crisis very, very unlikely, if not impossible. So the first thing I would say here is that, neo-Nazis played a key role in the overthrow of the previous Ukrainian government under Yanukovych in 2014. It was a violent overthrow. Over 30 police were killed by snipers and by gunfire during that period. Neo-Nazis occupied state buildings. They occupied regional parliaments. They smashed up the offices of opposing political parties, and they generally intimidated the police and those who opposed the Maidan. So they were able, in that moment, to guarantee the overthrow of the Yanukovych regime, which gave them a privileged position in the post-Yanukovych, in the post-Maidan Ukrainian state. I think that we can see the fascistic nature of the regime also in the socioeconomic policies that it's carried out, which have harmed the Ukrainian working class. I think it was in 2021, the Ptucha Institute in Kiev of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences estimated that over 50% of Ukrainians now lived in absolute poverty. And if you look at the socioeconomic indicators across the board, there's been a decline since 2014. We can see this in the neoliberal policies of privatizations, which have benefited local oligarchs, but also the international financial system through Ukraine's indebtedness now to the IMF to the tune of several billions, and the opening of the economy to transnational corporations, which have all been why there's been such a severe socioeconomic impact on the Ukrainian people. In politics, we can see it through the banning of the Communist Party, the coercion and intimidation and violence that has been used to intimidate the Russian-speaking population, but also the organizations of a potential political opposition since 2014. And I think fascism is often said to have a purpose, a specific purpose, which is a counter-revolutionary purpose to prevent a popular alternative from arising. And I think if we look at Ukraine as a post-Soviet state, a state in which in 2013, about a third of the population wanted to return to a planned economy, a state in which inclusion into the Russian sphere of influence fortifies, strengthens the role that Russia has as a contender state against US Western imperialism, means that fascism plays an important role within Ukraine as a counter-revolutionary project. When we look at Ukrainian society, I think it's very clear to see how the far right has been able to hegemonize discourse on history, on current affairs, on culture and language. I'm going to be finishing up. In culture, it's clear that there's a necrophiliac tendency to Ukrainian culture. Just in the Eurovision, was it last year or the year before? The singer appeared as an angel of death on a burning background of, burning trees, and it was a pretty grim picture. But I think this is part of a fetishization of death and of Nazi symbolisms and so on. And so the point here is that Ukrainian fascism doesn't exercise its domination in electoral forms. It's not reflected in parliament. It's reflected in their presence in the state institutions, their domination of the coercive institutions of the state, the military, the intelligence services, and the police. It's in their domination of national narratives and their ability to dominate how the state educates its people. And it's in their effective veto over government policy against peace. So, for example, just this weekend, one of the Ukrainian negotiators with Russia has been assassinated in Kiev. And, I think that is a clear indication of the incapacity of the Russian state to actually make a diplomatic solution. So I think there are other points. I'm sorry if I've run on, but I think that it's very important to be able to understand this character of the Ukrainian state and of Ukrainian fascism to be able to understand what's happening now. Thank you.
Absolutely, Victor. I mean, extremely valuable points. I hadn't really thought about that, but I think your mention of the cultural presence and of fascism is really, again, quite chilling. Our final speaker is Ben Norton. Ben is very well known. He is the founder and editor, most recently, of the independent news website Multipolarista, where he does original reporting in both English and Spanish. He was formerly a reporter and investigative journalist with The Grey Zone, and he has reported extensively from a variety of countries, chiefly Latin American, but he has also been following the present situation in Ukraine very closely and has been, of course, writing an enormous amount about US foreign policy and geopolitics. So Ben, you will be the last presenter today.
Thank you to Radhika. Thank you to everyone who's joined. I'll try to keep my comments pretty brief. I know people are probably tired, and also it's never fun going last because there have been so many great comments. I don't want to repeat all the other comrades and analysts here, but in my presentation briefly, I'm going to be focusing on the false claim that I believe that we need to criticize, that this is an inter-imperialist conflict. So The Russian intervention in Ukraine is decidedly not an inter-imperialist conflict. I'm going to talk about that today. I think that it's extremely misleading to see, people in the United States and people even who sometimes criticize U.S. foreign policy try to compare the Russian military intervention in Ukraine to the U.S. invasion of Iraq. I mean, this is spurious on so many grounds. First of all, Iraq is not the neighbor of the United States. Iraq is on the other side of the planet. The United States imposed brutal genocidal sanctions on Iraq for decades after invading Iraq in 1990 and destroying its civilian infrastructure. Of course, the conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it has its own unique historical conditions that is in no way comparable to the U.S. invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan, to the U.S. war in Libya, to the U.S. ongoing war in Yemen, which, by the way, has resulted in 377,000 dead Yemenis, according to the United Nations. And that's never mentioned, even though that's the largest humanitarian catastrophe on earth. We've seen this video of a mainstream political scientist at the University of Chicago, John Mersheimer. This video has gone viral of a 2015 lecture in which he goes through systematically and acknowledges how the United States, NATO, and the European Union created the conflict in Ukraine. People watching this probably know that those details. Ukraine has been in a civil war since 2014, essentially, because the United States overthrew the elected government of Ukraine in a coup in February 2014, so-called Maidan, in which a top U.S. State Department official, Victoria Nuland, was recorded in this leaked phone call, handpicking who the leaders of the Ukrainian puppet government would be after the coup in 2014. This is what led to the Russian-speaking Ukrainians in the eastern Donbass region to rise up against the Western puppet regime installed in Kiev and created a civil war. Now, former U.S. ambassador to Russia, who is now CIA director, William Burns, in a 2008 embassy cable, which was classified, but we have, thanks to WikiLeaks and political prisoner Julian Assange, published this. We now know that William Burns, the U.S. ambassador to Russia, was warning as far back as 2008 that the NATO aggressive expansion policy on Russia's borders could potentially lead to a Russian military intervention in Ukraine and could lead to civil war. Everything that he warned about in this cable in 2008 came true. So this conflict is very unique. It is nothing to do with the war in Iraq. It's a very unique situation. Now, of course, it's tragic. And that's not to say that Russia, should be praised, certainly not for invading a country. I mean, this is a very complex issue, but the reality is that Russia was up against a wall, geopolitically speaking, in terms of its security. It has been surrounded by NATO forces. It has been surrounded by Western military bases. The US and NATO have been sending billions of dollars of weapons to Ukraine, supporting neo-fascist elements, neo-Nazis. I think we also need to resist the comparison, which I think is facile, to World War I. 2022 is not 1914. Socialist states, for instance, did not exist in 1914. And I think that really needs to complicate our analysis. Imperialism, the highest age of capitalism, is a monumental historic text that we all need to understand, we all need to study, but it's not a religious text. It's not the Bible. We don't need to look to its words as if it's going to give divine knowledge for us in 2022. And also, let's keep in mind that Imperialism, the highest age of capitalism, was written in 1916, before the Bolshevik Revolution, before there were existing socialist states. Lenin was writing in a very different historical context, and not every single war that happens is World War I. I remember that there are people supporting or taking this neither Washington nor Moscow position on the war in Syria, basically defending imperialism's attempt to destroy a post-colonial Arab nation and trying to compare the Russian intervention in Syria at the behest of the sovereign state of Syria, trying to compare that to World War I, saying it was inter-imperialist. Now, Russia it's true that it did intervene against international law in Ukraine, but Ukraine does not have a sovereign government. The Ukrainian government is not like the Syrian government, which is a sovereign state. Ukraine has had a Western puppet regime since NATO overthrew its elected government in 2014 and installed a Western puppet regime. And now we even see the former prime minister of Ukraine, who was overthrown in 2014. He has referred to the current government as a puppet government. He said that Zelensky is a puppet, which is reaffirmed by the fact that Zelensky was elected in a landslide, promising peace with Russia, speaking Russian in his campaign, and then he entered office and has had actually no influence on the actual politics of Ukraine because he's essentially a Western puppet. Now, I think this is why we need to resist this idea that this is an inter-imperialist conflict. Inter-imperialist rivalry is not the right lens. There have been other attempts to update the analysis of imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. I think the economists Utsa Patnaik and Pravat Patnaik deserve major credit for their very influential, very interesting, very brilliant 2016 book, A Theory of Imperialism. But I think we can also even go to world systems theory and Immanuel Wallerstein. I mean, they're not necessarily Marxists. There are world systems theorists who, you could say are progressive liberals or whatever. But the point is that even in their sometimes bourgeois analysis of world systems theories, as recently as the early 2000s, Russia was listed as a peripheral country. Now, I don't think Russia is in the periphery anymore. You could say Russia is semi-peripheral, but Russia is decidedly not in the imperial core. Russia, the fact that it was part of the BRIC system, it still is part of the BRIC system, is a testament to the fact that Russia is not in the core. What are the countries in the BRICS? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. If someone tried to say that Brazil, India, China, and South Africa were part of the imperial core, I mean, you would ask what drug they were smoking. They're obviously not in the core. So the fact that Russia is part of this shows Russia's semi-peripheral status. Furthermore, if we try to simplify the basic elements of world systems theory, the core element of core countries is that they export consumer goods to exploit markets in the periphery, whereas the peripheral countries export raw materials to the core. Now, if we look at the bulk of Russia's GDP, where does it come from? It comes from the export of raw materials. Russia's largest exports are oil, coal, gas, wheat, iron, gold, platinum, aluminum, wood, copper, diamonds. This is not a peripheral country that is exporting its goods to its consumer goods to the imperial core. What Russian consumer goods are regularly consumed in the imperial core? Vodka? I mean, the only real Russian consumer good it's not really a consumer good. The only processed material is really fertilizer. So, I mean, Brazil does rely on Russian fertilizers. Again, it's semi-peripheral, but in many ways, the Russian economy is still peripheral. It has much more in common with the Iranian economy than it has with the US economy. So then there's also the element of national security. It is not hyperbolic to say that that Ukraine joining NATO is an existential threat to Russia. Now, Iraq, Syria, Libya, they were not existential threats to the United States. Anyone saying that Iraq is an existential threat to Washington, that's risible. It's ridiculous. But the existence of the Russian Federation as a country is precarious. There were, of course, attempts to try to balkanize Russia with the wars in Chechnya. And we know that the US government was involved in supporting Chechen independence, Chechen separatists. Ironically, some of these Chechen extremists later joined ISIS, including Omar Shashani, who was trained by the United States to wage war against Russia in Chechnya and also in Georgia. Now, we know US imperial planners have fantasized, salivated over the prospects of breaking up the Russian Federation. We know because of Robert Gates, the former defense secretary, he wrote in his memoir that Dick Cheney, the power behind the throne in the Bush administration, US vice president, architect of the Iraq war, Dick Cheney openly discussed, well, not openly, but within the circles in US foreign policy circles, he discussed the possibility of breaking up Russia. We know that Brzezinski, one of the most important imperial planners in the United States, he in 1997 published an article in Foreign Affairs in which he openly called for breaking up Russia into 3 different states: a European Russia, a Siberian Republic, and a Far Eastern Republic. This is a very real threat for Russia.
Less than a minute, Ben.
Sorry?
Less than a minute, Ben.
Yeah, this is a very real threat for Russia. It is not a threat for the United States. In the short term or the medium term, the United States is not going to be broken up. So finally, we should look at Russia's foreign policy. In its foreign policy, Russia has consistently been friends of the global South. And I'll end on this. There are other comments I wanted to make, but I'll end on this. I'm in Latin America. I'm in Nicaragua, a country with an existing socialist government, in Venezuela and in Cuba, and also Bolivia. These countries have consistently sided with Russia. Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua, the so-called troika of tyranny, according to Washington, you could call the troika of resistance with socialist governments, have all criticized NATO for starting the conflict in Ukraine, criticizing the United States for starting the civil war in Ukraine that Russia escalated by invading. And we can also look at China's policy. China has tried to mediate and is officially neutral, but China has also sided with Russia. Vietnam has also sided with Russia. I mean, these are existing socialist states. The DPRK has sided with Russia and criticized NATO. So it is not 1914. There are existing socialist governments. We should look at what those socialist governments are doing in their foreign policy. And then finally, all we have to do is look at the United Nations vote. We can see that not only were Vietnam and Venezuela and Nicaragua and Cuba and Bolivia and China all abstaining, and the DPRK either abstaining or voting in support of Russia. But we see that all of the countries basically that are siding with the imperial core are either the imperial core themselves or basically their protectorates, the reactionary Gulf monarchies, even Brazil. You know, Brazil has a far right Bolsonaro regime. So the reality is that it's a very facile understanding to say that this is an inter-imperialist conflict. And yes, it is very tragic for the people of Ukraine. It's also tragic for the people of Russia that Russia did take this step of invading. We can criticize elements of Russian foreign policy. Russia is not a socialist state, but the reality is that Russia does face very serious threats to the existence of Russia as a country, to its national security, that the United States does not face from countries like Iraq and others. And the reality is that the United States bears the responsibility for creating this war in Ukraine that Russia has militarily intervened in. So the last note I'll end on here is that we need to understand that there is an imperialist system. Russia is not part of the imperialist system. The imperialist system has unified against Russia over this decision. And we can criticize Russia for giving the imperialists a lot of ammunition for helping NATO merge together when Europe was actually, Russia was trying to woo Germany and trying to woo France. But the reality is that this decision has been made. Russia has been effectively barred from the Western economies. And this is accelerating a process of economic decoupling that we have seen for several years now. And I'll conclude saying that I think that now what we're going to see is more and more a bipolar system with two different financial and economic systems. The US-led SWIFT system created with the institutions created in the Bretton Woods Conference after the end of World War II with the IMF and the World Bank. And we're seeing an alternative created by Russia and China, a kind of Eurasian system. And we'll see other countries that might try to play different sides against each other. But the reality is that process we've seen of economic decoupling has gone on for several years now, but this has rapidly accelerated that process of decoupling.
Thank you so much, Ben. That was brilliant. 2022 is not 1914. There were no socialist countries in 1914. And the decoupling, the bifurcation of the world economy that began with 1917 continues. Thank you very much, Ben. That was really great. Okay, we are open for question and answers. I already see 3 hands up and about 18 questions in the question and answer thing. I know Victor and Rania have to leave, so I want to prioritize questions for them in particular. So first of all, let me ask of the 3 people who've raised their hands, if you have a question specifically for Rania, could you please indicate that in the chat? Meanwhile, I will read the one question I see here for Rania in particular. Sorry, I should say the 3 people, if you have questions for Rania or Victor, please indicate. Let me read the one question I see here for Rania. Rania, please elaborate on the dangers of sanctions to the Russian people and its impact on world economics. Please also speak to the threat of nuclear war. And if Putin is actually considering this option, how do we counter these war measures and build solidarity? So that's one question. Do I see anyone here? Yes. But before we go to the question and answer, Alan is reminding me that we had agreed that he was going to make a quick announcement just now. So Alan, please go ahead.
Yes, it's very straightforward. What are the 2 things that it's possible to do? The first is everything that Sarah and others have said, to resist war. But there's a second, and people have used the quote, "Truth is the first casualty in war." But there's another quote from Baruch Spinoza, which reads, I have striven not to laugh at human actions, not to weep at them, nor to hate them, but to understand them. Understanding is the most powerful weapon that we have, not just amongst ourselves, but for future generations. The purpose of these webinars and the Manifesto Group and the New Cold War website is to generate a basis for discussion. And you can help that. You can see from the character of this webinar. So there are three things that you can do. First, sign the manifesto, because that brings you into the discussions. Second, volunteer. You will see that there is a place on our site where you can say, I will undertake to help. And the third, it's very simple, donate. We have a three-part policy. We don't accept corporate donations, we don't accept advertising revenue, and we don't accept state funding. That means we depend on you. It would take 300 people to give us $10 per month to make us able to maintain what we do. More than that, and we can expand it. So share, subscribe, and donate, volunteer and donate. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful, Alan, because I've just now discovered that two other people need to go as well, Brian and Ben. So let me go straight to the questions. I'm going to ask one other question and take one speaker from the floor here. So Fuad Seva says, during the Ukraine crisis, it became obvious Western media and even sports institutions are using double standards. They're amplifying the events in Ukraine while they're staying mute when it comes to the terrible Israeli violence on Palestine. So can you please reflect on that? And Burton Steck, I'm going to allow you to speak. So please go ahead. Are you there, Burton? Burton, are you there? Okay, I'm going to go to Hugh Goodacre in that case. Hugh, please go ahead.
There must be a mistake there because I didn't intend to raise my hand.
Okay, no worries
So-
then. Then I will go to Steve Walker. Steve, please go ahead. Okay, fine. Then I will just read a third question. Linda Christian asks, question for Brian Becker. I agree the left needs a clear vision and a unified, inclusive vision. Unfortunately, I see the left reacting to this and that, but not advocating a vision that will appeal to more than a few small groups in the West. How do we go to appealing more widely? So I see now there are Brian wishes to speak, Sarah wishes to speak, and if Rania and Rania, I think perhaps I should give Rania the first a chance, and then since one of the questions was explicitly for her, then Brian, then Sarah.
Yeah, so I'll keep it brief because I know Brian has to answer a question and go as well. But to the issue of sanctions, I think it's an important issue to address very briefly. I'm sitting in a semi-sanctioned country right now in Lebanon, and I see the impact of the economic collapse here in addition to the sanctions on both Lebanon and the more severe sanctions on Syria on a daily basis. And we've seen, I think, even more severe sanctions placed on Russia, a country of 144 million people. We already have about, I think, a third of the world living under US sanctions. But to add a country as large as Russia to that is just to basically immiserate 144 million people, to first and foremost, to devalue their currency so that their salaries and their life savings become nearly worthless as it devalues more and more against the dollar. We've already seen the ruble lose a tremendous amount of its value. So that's one thing. And that, of course, is a bunch of, effects off of that, which is people have less money to purchase necessary items like food and fuel. Whether that will happen in Russia, which produces a lot of stuff as well, we'll see. But the interesting thing about Russia is, on top of seeing the kind of misery that we've seen in places like Venezuela and Iran or Syria or Cuba from the impact of US sanctions, there's also going to be a ricochet effect, or like a boomerang effect, onto the West, and not just onto the West, but onto the developing world, because much of the world depends on Russia for wheat, for example. Lebanon gets the vast majority of its wheat from both Russia and Ukraine, and prices have dramatically increased since this war started. both because of the war and because of sanctions. There's also the fertilizer, the price of fertilizer. Most of the world gets it from Russia. That is going to increase, already has, and it's going to increase more, which is going to affect the ability to grow food, even in the US. Prices of fertilizer are already going up. So rich countries are going to be affected by this. And the developing world, which is already poor, it's already experiencing increasing poverty because of COVID. It's going to be worse for people in those places. So these sanctions aren't just on Russians, and it's going to devastate Russia, but it's also on the rest of the world that depends on Russia. And the developing world is going to be hurt the most. And I think that's really important to emphasize. To the issue of sports, I think this completely exposes the hypocrisy of these international sporting institutions like FIFA, which have repeatedly refused to kick Israel out for actually violating their terms. But when it comes to Russia, it was overnight, one sporting institution after another, as well as all these cultural boycotts of Russia. When, you've got people saying things like, oh, you support, BDS on Israel, but you don't support sanctions on Russia. Nobody is suggesting that we should deny average Israelis access to basic items and cut them off and isolate them from the world. That's not what BDS is about. BDS is about sanctioning institutions in Israel that are complicit in the Israeli occupation, which happens to include many of Israel's higher academic institutions and many of Israel's sporting institutions, including teams that are based out of the occupied areas. So I just want to make that distinction because I'm sure everybody on this panel has experienced that and people who are watching. But anyways, I will leave it at that because I do have to run, and I know Brian's got to run too and has to answer questions as well. But thank you so much for including me in this excellent panel, and I hope this conversation continues.
Thank you so much, Rania. I would just like to say I'm going to Brian, but if you have Brian, please go ahead. Oh, I know what I meant to say. Panelists, if you wish to speak to the questions that I have posed, please raise your hands as well. Brian, please go ahead.
Sure. Thank you, Radhika. And I'll make it brief as well. Ben Norton correctly pointed out that that this isn't like World War I, and he said why. But there are elements that are similar to the beginning of any war, including the beginning of World War I. And what I'm talking about is the capitulation of the Social Democratic Second International in the main to their own capitalist governments under the pressure of war hysteria. And so the question posed to me is, like, how do we develop a broader vision? And I think we have to recognize that we are at the beginning of a new shift in world politics. This isn't a temporary conjuncture. There are temporary conjunctural elements to it, but this is the entrance of, this is what a multipolar world actually does look like. And the multipolar world that existed before both world wars actually led to world wars. And the fact of the matter is that the left in the beginning of the war in World War I essentially capitulated to the propaganda of their own imperialist ruling class because it was so hard to stand up and defy your own ruling class under the pressure where it's not just the bourgeoisie, but your neighbors, your fellow workers, people on the campus, the people who are your longtime friends, including progressive friends, have been swept up into the war hysteria. So I would say this, and it's not possible to give a comprehensive answer. The most important thing at a moment like this is to hold on to our principles and to our values. In other words, when you can't really win the public over at that very moment because the hysteria is too great, the wind of reaction is too strong, we must not adapt to the reaction. We must not accommodate to reaction. We must not accommodate to the ruling class propaganda that has taken the rest of society in tow. So I would say, first and foremost, let's explain what we mean by socialism, what we mean by anti-imperialism, to give persuasive arguments, to demand that people understand that this was caused by world imperialism and US imperialism in particular, to find avenues where we can be in the streets. We're all in the streets in some ways. We had the same experience Sarah mentioned here in Washington, DC, where we were very, very outnumbered, but we stood our ground in order to find some public manifestation of true anti-imperialism. But the most important thing is not to adapt, not to give in, not to surrender to the reaction, and to be able to articulate, as Lenin did in 1914 and 15, how the contradictions, the existential contradictions posed by global war are the outcome or the reflection of capitalism. And if you want peace, if we want peace, which all humans do, we must find a way to adopt an anti-capitalist perspective, but that alone is insufficient. Anti-capitalism can be the watchword of many different political and ideological currents, including right-wing currents. So this is the moment when we have to uphold the banner of socialism, the banner of the kind of anti-capitalism that leads in the direction of international solidarity, to go back to basic concepts that have been eviscerated over the last 30 years after the collapse, not only of the Soviet Union, but the world communist movement. Ideas that have been eviscerated. There's been a 2-generation skip in basic elementary Marxist understandings that were the achievement of 150 years of class struggle on a global scale. We have to reaffirm those ideas. So in many ways, the battle of ideas is the moment that we're in. We cannot win public opinion overall right now, but we can sustain our own principles, our values, and maintain a persuasive presentation of those principles and values in an anti-capitalist perspective, including the idea that socialism is the answer. It's not multipolarity that's the answer to unipolarity of imperialism. It's the socialist movement globally that offers a forward-facing, optimistic way that world politics and the world economic system can be changed that provides social justice.
Great, thanks, Brian. I have Sarah, I have Helena. Go ahead, Sarah.
Thank you. Thank you. Very important discussion. I want to just come back to what do we do? How do we move forward? And the slogans that we raise, so important. And stop NATO war on Russia. I really want to propose we think how to explain and use that, because it is a NATO war. Stop the NATO war. And we need a unified response. Our problem is not Russia, it's racism, it's cutbacks, it's a war right here and the war there. And focusing our attention on that is so, so important. Now, I also really do want to focus on what did the US want in this war? And what were they threatened by? So let me just take a minute on that. US imperialism is threatened that the biggest investor in Russia was the European Union. US imperialism is threatened that Germany and the other EU countries had a growing trade with Russia and with China. Very important. There's 20 long trains a day coming through Russia, coming from China, through Russia into Europe. Is that a threat to US imperialism? US imperialism is threatened that the EU and especially Germany purchase substantial oil and gas from Russia. This competes with US fracked gas. The United States is today the biggest exporter of gas, and they have to find markets. They've spent a fortune in developing this very expensive fracked gas. So I think the more we're able to explain what's in it, why they're fighting, why the NATO war machine exists to push US markets. I also I think it was very important, the points that Ben Norton raised on imperialism. Now, it's not just size. Canada is geographically larger than the US, but its economy is 1/10 the size, and it has no military machine. Its economy is substantially owned by the US. Now, Russia is geographically larger than Canada, the EU, the US, but the Russian economy is smaller than Canada. It's smaller than Brazil, smaller than South Korea. It ranks about 12th, and it is an exporter of raw material. nevertheless, it is in a block. It has given assistance to Syria, to Lebanon, to Venezuela, to Iran, to Cuba. It's in a living exchange with China. So this is what they want to break. We need to explain this when we have a chance, but first we have to draw the line in convincing and explaining to working people right here in our own country that this is a US NATO war. If we can turn that, and we should be prepared, we will be isolated. It's not easy at the beginning of any imperialist war, but because it creates an economic crisis at home in each of these areas, the mood will change. And we should know that also. I think we should just be convinced that that change, and the clearer we are in our demands and in our focus, the stronger we will be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Now, I know I have Helena. I thought that John had raised his hand as well, but go ahead, Helena. Oh, and before you go ahead, actually, I think maybe it would be a lot more efficient if panelists can look at the questions that are in the chat that they want to respond to, and also in the Q&A, and then raise your hands as you feel you want to respond. So, Helena, go ahead.
Yes, it won't be long. It's really several brief points. First of all, I agree with Ben. He provided an excellent analysis. Russia is not an imperialist country. For Russia, this is the last stance. This war in Ukraine, unfortunately, Russia was cornered and had no choice. And there was a question about whether there were any other means left. I think no. I think it's clear for everybody who can see that it was really, they lost their patience and they tried everything they could, including diplomatic ties, and it's clear that this was the end of it. Another point, I think the Russians, maybe Professor Barabanov will provide a better insight, but from what I see, according to the last poll, 70% of Russians actually support Putin. And it's not just about Putin, it's about another maybe take on another alternative view on an alternative take on the whole, how to live in this world, how to organize society. So this is not just about, and Ukraine, Putin in many official statements, he was very careful not to talk about the Ukrainian people. He has always talked about the Ukrainian leadership. So in his own way, he I know it sounds maybe unbelievable now, but he does care about Ukraine in his own way. And from how the Russian army is fighting on the ground, they try to spare civilians, but of course it's a war, so it's futile, and it is a decision that came very hard to him. And it's clear that he won't negotiate with Zelensky because he sees no point in it. Zelensky is a puppet. You see the negotiations, how Ukrainians protract, how they take a couple of days to come back with the answers. And as Victor mentioned, there was one of the main members of the negotiating crew who was killed in Ukraine right in broad daylight. It's clear that these negotiations will lead nowhere. And that's why, by the way, I was looking for ways to, because, I'm a Ukrainian, and I won't talk about how personally what it cost me. It's no point. But I was looking for voices in Canada, where I could stand up with those voices. And that's why I couldn't. Maybe now I'm listening to you, and I'm hearing voices that I would like to hear, because it's very difficult. There are very few Ukrainians who are actually, there were questions about Ukrainian left. Ukrainian left is split, first of all, and second, it's not organized. Since the Communist Party was banned, it has been a very difficult time for Ukrainian left. And I saw a couple of names, maybe I'll connect with those people. So this is my take, and examples of how US is supporting neo-Nazis. Well, from what I heard, and what I read, there were actual instructors from the US Army who were training these Ukrainian, and I mean, not that I heard, we saw it in the mainstream media, how NATO instructors were training neo-Nazi battalions Azov, and this was officially recognized, and there are many others. many other that we didn't see, published in the mainstream media, and that was raised in the Quebec Globe and Mail and other media outlets. And the last point maybe that I want to bring, it happened incidentally, because it was a point about mainstream media and how we block the blockade. It's very difficult, right? Because mainstream media in Canada and throughout the Western world, that they cover this conflict from one perspective. And when I was contacted by Radio Canada, it was purely incidentally because anyway, it doesn't matter. And I talked to them, it probably and surprised them because they didn't expect to hear from me what I was saying. And after that, a couple of days later, I was contacted by RT International. And to my regret, I had to decline the interview because I fear, not that I don't fear, but I don't want to lose my job. I don't want to, I have a family to protect, and it's been a very long, not fight for me, but I think it is important that we break this blockade, and our voices have to be heard. But I don't have any links to the Ukrainian left. Maybe I should reach out and see what we can do. So these are my points, and thank you.
Thanks, Helena. I have John, Victor, and Oleg in that order. John, Victor, would you like to go before if you have to leave? No. Okay. John, Victor, Oleg, and Benjamin.
Yes, I just want to say, I think there are no military experts in this particular seminar, whatever its other virtues are. So I don't think we should get too involved in that, right? Okay. But what I've been looking at some of the questions which saying, is this to the benefit of NATO, the situation which has developed? Well, I think on that, we have to take a very objective view of our place in the world, because I think the people here are mainly what we might call the Western left, right? So let's look at the forces which are resisting US imperialism. The most powerful force in the world, which is resisting US imperialism, is China. And I can tell you, because I follow it every single day very closely, if you look at the reactions in China, 90% or more of the population is supporting Russia in this struggle. That's one. Second most powerful force in the world I take to be opposing US imperialism is Russia. And there, I think that the most crucial factor always in Russia has been Russian patriotism. I seriously think that parts of the left that we might well like very much personally made an enormous error, fundamental strategic error, by not understanding that after 1991, the key question was the defense of Russia against external attacks. And the key question, therefore, in Russia was the Russian patriotic response to the attacks that made on it. They went in for abstract internationalism of the type of sort of Rosa Luxemburg and other people, instead of understanding that the fundamental struggle in Russia was over the question of defense of Russia and Russian patriotism. And therefore, people who I like very much became irrelevant in the situation because they got the wrong strategic line on that. Third is the question of the global south. If you see that the responses which are coming out, for example, from Evo Morales, statements from Cuba, statements from Nicaragua, statements from Venezuela, it's very, very funny. I don't know if people saw. The New York Times is now referring to Maduro as President Maduro, having carefully avoided this for the last 4 years. And the United States has dispatched a group of people to Venezuela, presumably to try to detach Venezuela from Russia. Shows what happens when the US encounters an obstacle. Maybe the situation becomes a bit better. I doubt, or I hope, and I very much doubt that Venezuela will be taken in by this nonsense. And then the question of the situation, the globe, what you might call the left in the global north is the weakest in this situation. I'm all in favor of it, and we're here, and I'm in favor of getting everybody together on that. But it's the weak, and exactly what people have said, we have to maintain the exact correct policy in that, but it's the weakest element in the situation. And we should not imagine therefore that the reaction in the world to what is happening in Ukraine is at all equivalent to the situation which is happening in the Western left. I take it very interesting. For example, India has refused to go along with sanctions against Russia. Pakistan has actually ordered a very large quantity of wheat and oil from Russia, and I don't think they're going along with it. So it's true that in the Western left, there is a great deal of disorganization, demoralization, and wrong positions at the present time. But I don't think that that necessarily means at all that the situation on the world scale is in line with that, because I follow, as I say, I take it in order. Most powerful is China, second most powerful is Russia, third most powerful is the global South, and fourth is the global West. So we shouldn't, we are dealing in a very defensive situation, but we shouldn't lose sight of the real situation. That would the point I would make in response to these things about whether NATO is gaining. Right, end.
Thank you, John. Victor, please go ahead.
Thanks. I just wanted to make a point in relation to NATO's involvement in this war. I think there is a direct involvement. I'm sure we know that there are Western mercenaries with Ukrainian forces, and also NATO electronic warfare and surveillance aircraft have been patrolling the border with Ukraine, and satellite intelligence is no doubt being provided to Ukrainian forces. So that I think it is important to highlight that this isn't a war that NATO isn't participating in. There is a participation. The second thing relates to sanctions. I think one of the objectives of the US sanctions and of the many corporate sanctions that have been voluntarily brought in is to undermine Russia's elite consensus as a prelude to trying to undermine Putin. After all, Putin is going to be going into an electoral process in the next 2 or 3 years, and being able to limit elite access to holiday homes in the Côte d'Azur, to their yachts in the Mediterranean, and to elite sports cars and participation in elite events around the world is, I think, going to hit them hard. I think in relation to Helena's point about the defensive nature of the war, I think we need to bear in mind the cultural and social challenge that the Ukrainian state poses to Russia after 2014 is quite significant, because it challenges the very notion of what it is to be Russian. It challenges the Russian historical narrative around who they are and their relationship to their brother peoples in Belarus and Ukraine. And so it's not just a military threat, it's also a more intangible threat to the cultural, social unity of the perceived cultural unity in Russia. The final point I wanted to make was in the shocking way in which many on the Western left have abandoned any critical judgment of the media. The same, for example, here in the UK, the same media which destroyed Jeremy Corbyn, which used this ostensible anti-Semitism in the Labour Party to destroy the Labour Party, or to destroy the left in the Labour Party in the UK, that critical distance has suddenly been abandoned, and all of these narratives around what is happening in the war and are being swallowed hook, line, and sinker. And I think that we should bear in mind that we need to regain that critical distance. And I think that's one of the main reasons why RT and so many other Russian outlets have been banned in the West. Anyway, I think this has been an amazing seminar. And I think it's really important to sign up to the work of the Manifesto Group. And thank you for holding this meeting and for standing up for the genuine internationalism and socialism in this very difficult time.
Thanks very much, Victor. Oleg, you are next.
Yeah, thank you. I've seen the list of the questions, and also I was seeing the chat. There were a couple of questions to me personally. One is how can we predict the reaction of Russian society if the war continues and became longer and longer? Would it be so, let's say, hardened around Putin, or would it be turned against Putin? Sure, for now it's difficult to say, because now we'll see what I would say a limited panic within the wider Russian society, because people are trying to take cash from their bank accounts. People are trying to buy all Western domestic appliances, like may be useless for a moment, but for the future, like TV sets, frigories, and so on. So, but this for me would raise a point of the effectiveness and the real aims of sanctions, because all the sanctions are proclaimed that they are not against the people, but against the regime. But if we can see the history of all sanctions, let's say sanctions against Iraq, sanctions against Venezuela or Iran or North Korea, we can like their regimes or not, don't like their regimes, but the sanctions make nothing for the stability of the regimes in practice. And the real victims of the sanctions are the ordinary people. So in that sense, there may be some cynical logic to put all sanctions on the ordinary people, that to how to say, to stimulate them for some uprising, for some revolutions, for some anti-regime movements. But we also saw in Venezuela case that this incitement to ordinary people hardened by sanctions to remove President Maduro and support Juan Guaido was generally useless. In Iraq and Iran, it didn't work as well. So as far as I see, this politic of sanctions is not effective, in the sense that it will not give nothing to the regime, but it will not provoke the revolution, for sure, but the ordinary people will be victims. Another question that I had, it was interesting on Russia-China link. There was a question about the common declaration when Putin and Xi Jinping signed at the beginning of the Beijing Olympics on more or less coordinated approach to the new world order, to new threats, and so on. I think John Ross already raised this question and this link between China and Russia, and how it's important to maintain this link. I'd like to say, still Boris Kagarlitsky would say it with much more strength than me, that sure that, and Radhika, we discussed with you many times and with Alan, that it's a kind of paradox and irony that for me, a right-wing revisionist imperialist Russia is playing with left communist China. But the common enemy, as the global US imperialism, is consolidating this Russia-China link, and I think that it will continue. Another question which was discussed from this initial question, which was discussed quite widely in Russia, would China do the same? Would China start the liberation of Taiwan at the same time as Russia doing its military campaign in Ukraine? I don't have any questions. We can discuss it, but for the moment, I see the Chinese approach is quite moderate. China saying that officially that they support the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but they understand the historical reasons of the Russian actions. But I think that is I've also seen in one English language Chinese publications that China is studying the Russian experience and now in Ukraine and sanctions and all this. And after that, there was some advices from the Chinese experts not to follow the Russian path, not to oppose directly and militarily to the US and Western military machine, not to pose China under sanctions, but to continue the peaceful economic rising and with the aim to overcome the US later. And some Chinese experts just named it the Russian operation in Ukraine as the second strategic mistake of Russia. The first one was the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the second one is now. And finally, it was not a question for me, but it was, I've seen the quite interesting discussion in the chat whether Russia is imperialist or no, how can we react? So as I said at the beginning, so everybody has to has the right for his or her own vision in that sense. But what is important politically now, what John mentioned, that now Russia and China are in the same bloc, and I think it would be counterproductive for the global left to block this, to break this bloc. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Oleg. I think we are now been going for nearly 2.5 hours. So I suggest we wrap this up at the half hour. So I'm going to give Ben and Sarah, and quickly, if John, last words, and then we will end this session. And apologies to everybody whose questions did not get answered, but thank you very much. The chat discussion has been extremely rich as well, and we'll be saving it. So, okay. Ben, Sarah, and then John.
All right, well, I'll try to keep this very short. I wanted to make a few points in response to questions about the economics of the situation. I talked about, from a world systems theory analysis, Russia is semi-peripheral. The vast majority of its exports and its GDP come from raw materials, not from processed goods, consumer goods going to the imperial core. I think there's also an important distinction to make, and I'll borrow this analysis from economist Michael Hudson, a brilliant analyst. And he talks about the important distinction between financial capitalism and industrial capitalism. And the reality is that, yes, Russia certainly has a capitalist economy. The Russian Federation is not the Soviet Union. But the reality is that the Russian economy is also not the same economy as the United States. And that's another facile, simply false comparison that we hear from people saying this is an inter-imperialist conflict. The reality is that the Russian economy is much more protectionist, and you could say resource nationalist, than the ultra-capitalist neoliberal US economy. Now, yes, the Russian economy is not socialist, it is capitalist, but not all forms of capitalism are the same. And Michael Hudson talks about the three oligarchies that dominate the US economy and therefore political system. Those three are the military-industrial complex is one, then there are the oil, gas, and mining interests being two, and then the fire sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. Professor Hudson argues, I think correctly, that these three oligarchies control the US political and economic system. They represent the ruling class. In Russia, it is very different. There are estimates on this, but a significant part of Russia's GDP comes from state-owned industries. And many of those state-owned enterprises are based on exports of raw materials. So the IMF in 2012 actually claimed, I think this is dubious, the IMF claimed that 71% of Russia's GDP came from state-owned enterprises. Now, the IMF has an interest in exaggerating that number because the IMF is, of course, arguing that Russia should privatize those state-owned industries. But there was a study done by the Harvard Kennedy School, which, you know, is a mouthpiece of the US ruling class, certainly not leftist anti-imperialists. And the Harvard Kennedy School estimated that between 33 and 46% of Russia's of GDP comes from state-owned companies. Now, in China, an estimated around 30% of its GDP comes from state-owned enterprises. I mean, even this is a very blunt analysis, but according to this statistic, I mean, Russia has more state influence over its GDP than even China. And if you look at the top 18 largest companies in Russia, 12 of the 18 largest companies are state-owned, including the largest company, which is Gazprom, along with Rosneft, Sberbank, Russian Railways, Rostec. The reality is that the fossil fuel industries, finance, transportation, and infrastructure are owned by the Russian state. They're managed by the Russian state. It's not necessarily the commanding heights of the economy, because then you also have other parts like the agriculture sector, which is very important in the Russian economy, and other industries. They are privatized. Agriculture is largely in private hands because of the neoliberal shock therapy imposed on the Russian Federation in the 1990s. But the reality is that, again, although I'm not arguing that Russia is secretly socialist, it's not. I am arguing that Russia has a resource nationalist economy that is not explicitly neoliberal. And another reality is that regardless of what you think about the political character of the Russian government, which I don't think is a model that should be applied to other countries, you know, I'm not saying that I'm a fan of the Kremlin's political model. The reality is that the capitalist oligarchs in Russia don't control the state anymore. The state controls the capitalist oligarchs. And one of the main differences you constantly hear Russians say about Boris Yeltsin and Putin is that Putin imposed that political discipline on the oligarchs. In the 1990s, when Russia was effectively a kind of colony of the United States, Boris Yeltsin allowed the government to be run by the capitalist oligarchs. Today, the government runs the country. Now, you can criticize—
in the interest of time, if you would wrap up, please.
Of course. Now, you can criticize a lot of the decisions made by the Russian government, especially internally. And I'm certainly not a fan of some of the conservative policies of the Russian government. But the note I'll end on here is that we can criticize the social conservatism and cultural conservatism of the Russian government. But I think we can make those same criticisms of Iran. And I don't think anyone seriously would argue that Iran is an imperialist power. I think in many ways, Russia and Iran have a lot of political and economic similarities. And you could say that Iran is more conservative, but Iran in its foreign policy plays an objectively anti-imperialist role in supporting revolutionary movements in the global south, in supporting Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, in supporting revolutionary forces in Yemen, in supporting the resistance in Lebanon, in fighting the settler colonialist resistance of apartheid Israel. So the reality is that, yes, we can criticize elements of Putin's ideology, but that's true for Iran, and neither country is imperialist.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry to cut you off. I just hate doing it, but we do have to end. 2 minutes each, Sarah and John.
Okay, in 2 minutes. The no-fly zone means a real expansion of NATO war. This is not getting better. It's going deeper. US, NATO has the same strategy to China. That's what Taiwan and the reinforced arming of Taiwan, that's what the whole campaign on Xinjiang means. It's how to get in and start a war, how to cut development, how to create division, how to divert, how to instigate. Now, China, frankly, is stronger, has a government that is determined to maintain socialist development. It has capitalists too, but they know who is directing this. So very important. And China takes a long view on this. So I think they're less likely to be drawn into this. We should keep in mind that sanctions will and are impoverishing the targeted countries, but they also will impoverish the US population right here. And they are, when you look at what's happening, whether it's the dollar or gas prices or food prices or inflation, the drop in life expectancy, in wages right here. That is what happens in a war-sanctioned economy. It is disastrous for working people everywhere. I think we can't be knocked over by this. The role of the corporate media is to marginalize, it's to demonize the opposition. The role of the corporate media is to say you're insignificant, and US imperialism is the decider. And we gotta not buy into that line. And I think forcefully say that we speak for the overwhelming majority of the world. So let's keep clear, focused demands and analysis. Clear demand will resonate. It will resonate. So I'll close with saying, disband NATO, stop the US-NATO war on Russia. Thank you.
Brilliant point, Sarah. Last word to John, 2 minutes, please.
Yeah, war is one of the few questions on which high bourgeois thought and Marxist thought have exactly the same conclusion, which is formulated by Clausewitz, that war is the continuation of politics by other means, a view endorsed by Marx, Engels, and Lenin. Right, okay. The thing which Lenin wrote on this is that the most nonsense theory of war is who fired the first shot. That's not relevant at all. Let's make a comparison, a male comparison, a female comparison, right? A male comparison is the following. If somebody is surrounded by a group of thugs in a car park, it may or may not be the best tactic to hit them first. But we're not going to claim that this was aggression if the person there decides to hit them first. Or to take the female one, if a woman is subjected to years of abuse and physical attacks by her husband and she decides to kill him, this may or may not be the best tactic to deal with the situation, as opposed to alternatives, you know, the law, invocation of feminine movements, etc., etc. But we're not going to get into the situation of condemning her because that she's the aggressor in this situation. She's not, she's defending herself. And that's the fundamental thing that we've got to get right in this. This is a systematic, prolonged attack by Russia, against Russia by NATO. People can have different views on whether it was right for Russia to act now, to invade, not to invade, maybe it was premature, all sorts of things. We don't need to get into that. The fundamental thing, this is an act of defense against the aggression which is carried on against Russia. And that's the fundamental view that we have to view of the situation. Exactly what high bourgeois thought and Marxist thought says, that war is the continuation of politics by other means. And we have to look, therefore, what is the politics behind this? And this is 30 years of aggression of NATO against Russia. Right, end.
Thank you so much, John. On that note, I think we would all agree that we cannot understand what's going on right now without understanding the long political history, the long geopolitical history, and I might add, the political economy and geopolitical economy underlying this present situation. Everybody, thank you so much. The panelists, I think you have all been brilliant. I think we've had a lot of stuff to think about, even when there have been disagreements among them, of which there have been plenty. I think we've all been trying to understand this perspective, this situation from a left-wing point of view, and the left-wing points of view that are relevant in different parts of the world. What is relevant in Russia? What is relevant in the West, both the United States and Europe, etc. So I think we've had a great discussion. This issue is not going anywhere, and I'm pretty sure we will be meeting again to discuss this further, unfortunately, but at the same time, it will be necessary. So thank you all. Please look out for further International Manifesto Group events. And thank you to all our co-sponsors, the Answer Coalition, UNAC, and I think I forget one, but I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the page at the moment. But thank you to all of them, and look forward to seeing you in other important discussions. I hope this has been helpful. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.